So as you watch this video, I'm watching live coverage of the Florida House of Representatives 8 o'clock meeting here, where they will take up in a few minutes the revisions to the foreclosure legislation that's currently pending. One of the things that's most disturbing about this current debate regarding foreclosures is the asserted need to change the laws that exist to respond to conditions out there in courtrooms across the state of Florida. As we listened to the Senate debate on Monday, I heard a lot of discussion about the need to get foreclosures moving through the courtrooms and therefore the need to pass legislation to improve that process. What is missing from the discussion is an analysis of the real problem that exists in foreclosures. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of foreclosures clogged up in Florida's courtrooms are there because of problems with the banks. The laws that exist in Florida to deal with foreclosures have been relatively consistent since around the turn of the century, some revisions in the 20s and the 30s, but the fact of the matter is that from the beginning of Florida's statehood, attorneys and mortgage holders have been foreclosing on property quite efficiently, thank you very much, and it's only in the last couple of years that we've recognized problems in foreclosures. But the problems in foreclosures are nothing to do with the laws that exist or the job that our judicial branch is doing, and frankly, it has nothing to do with homeowners or foreclosure defense attorneys. The important thing to recognize is what is now common knowledge across the country, that the problems that exist in our courtrooms in foreclosure cases are the problems borne by the banks themselves. Our court system, funded as it is with less than 1% of the state's budget, does an incredible job in processing cases efficiently and effectively, given the extraordinarily scarce resources that the legislature provides. But the fact of the matter is that the laws on our books are sufficient to do the job required to complete foreclosures. Now, we heard in the Senate debate, and you hear a lot of rhetoric and argument now surrounding abandoned properties, and that's an area that really deserves some comment, because the fact of the matter is that when properties are abandoned, when the homeowner has not responded, the bank could get a foreclosure judgment in an instant. Affidavit of diligent search, a non-service on the homeowner, and publication, and the home could be set up at a foreclosure sale in a matter of just a couple of months. And so all of this discussion about the need to pass legislation to get these abandoned houses off the market and through foreclosure lacks analysis that we would expect out of our legislative bodies to understand how the law currently functions and how the legislation that's proposed here will not address the problems at hand. The fact of the matter, again, and this bears repeating, the foreclosure cases that are pending in Florida's courtrooms are stuck there not because foreclosure defense attorneys have thrown a wrench in their works and not because homeowners have provided any defense. They are stalled, they are stuck, they are filed and forgotten because of the banks and institutions. Which brings us back to the larger point, a societal point, a legal point, economic and social point, and that is this. If our legislators don't recognize the fury that is building across this country because the banks and institutions have not been held accountable at all, then they are tone deaf to the politics in this nation right now. And this legislation that is being pushed through is a perfect example of what is wrong because, frankly, the voices of citizens are being drowned out by rhetoric and the push by other well-financed and well-represented parties, and the interests of citizens and consumers are not being properly represented or listened to. The legislation is undoubtedly going to change. There are some amendments and revisions that are being made to it, but we have to stop and question what is the purpose of the legislation when in fact it doesn't address the root causes. Again, in the Senate committee on Monday, I heard a lot of commentary about how we had to push through these foreclosures in order to get Florida's economy moving. And to challenge this assertion that the key to Florida's economic future is foreclosures, I ask our representatives and senators this question. What if you had that magic wand and were able to wave it over our foreclosure courtrooms and grant foreclosure judgment to every single foreclosure case that is currently stalled in courtrooms tomorrow? What would be the economic effect of this magic wand? Would throwing hundreds of thousands of Floridians out into the street somehow improve our economy? Absolutely not. And even if we're talking about some incremental increase in the volume of foreclosures, the fact of the matter is that that's not the key to any economic recovery. I suspect that if the legislation passes in its current form, it will be subject to challenge and dispute, not just from homeowners, but from our friends, the banks. It's an interesting dynamic to think that homeowners might be on the side in some ways of banks. I dare say that the banks, who incidentally have not come out in support of this legislation, and in my mind, if they're not actively supporting legislation aimed at their critical issue, that's as good as being opposed to the legislation. But it is telling to me that at this point in time, the banks come out not supporting the legislation and therefore opposed to the legislation. It's a demonstration to me that something is critically wrong here. Clearly, the interest group that is pursuing this case are the homeowners associations and condo associations. It's important to keep in mind that these very powerful and important groups have important resources already at their disposal to affect the change that they need. The fact of the matter is homeowners associations can set their cases for sale and become title owners of property ahead of the banks if they choose not to do so. And then they can pursue their cases aggressively. But the fact of the matter is that they don't do that in all cases for reasons which are still inexplicable to many people. But more importantly, the banks and institutions themselves not pushing their own cases towards foreclosure is a recognition of incentives and perverse financial incentives within their institutions at the federal level and otherwise. It's important to focus not just on foreclosure cases that are filed, but what's happening with those foreclosure cases once they finally go to foreclosure sale. An important consideration, again, is to look at what is happening with foreclosure sales. We focus all of our time and attention on the foreclosure case through filing and sort of ignore what happens when it goes to sale. But a critical element of the analysis is for legislators, policymakers, and all stakeholders to recognize what's happening at foreclosure sales. In years past, when 100 homes would go up to a public auction, maybe 50 or 60% of them would go to third-party bidders. But the fact of the matter is, if you take a survey of foreclosure sales all across the state, you'll find that in the vast majority of cases, those final judgments, final judgments for plaintiffs and the sales, the vast majority of the properties are returning back to the banks at $100 bids. Now, why is this? If the purported intent of a foreclosure case from the very beginning is that ultimately a bank would have a foreclosure sale and that property would sell to another party. I heard senators comment that we need to get these properties in the hands of more deserving or useful people or something to that effect. Well, they've got the opportunity to do that. The foreclosure sale happens, and third-party bidders can bid and purchase these properties and get them in, the hands of better people, better class of people, I suppose. But the fact of the matter is the banks are not letting the properties go on the free market and they're not letting the free market determine what's the value of property. So for all our good Republican friends out there, we need to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of foreclosure if the corporate interests are not allowing the free market to determine what's the value of that asset, and they're not allowing that property to go back onto the market so that those more deserving and useful people can move into them and use these properties. The problem that's going to exist if this pushes through in its current form or anything like it is it's going to put in the driver's seat potentially other parties to these foreclosure cases, and I think the banks and certainly homeowners are going to have real problems with that. But the interesting dynamic will be to see what the banks do with this. We need to continue the advocacy work in a respectful and constructive manner, and hope that our legislators will wake up and recognize that if they pass legislation in response to the industry problems, we're rewarding wrongful conduct and setting a very bad precedent for the future. We need to work together on this, but the way to solve the foreclosure problem is to do it within the construct of our existing laws and rules, and to give our court systems, importantly, the funding they need to do their job properly.